To be clear up front, this is not a scenario I am predicting or think is at all likely to happen. In the short to medium term, I would say it's basically an impossibility, and in the long term, it may well be as well. However, I have seen it proposed, and I thought it interesting enough to warrant some attention. So, let's talk about the concept of Nintendo onshoring switch to assembly to the USA as a way to cope with tariffs. Currently, there is an exemption in terms of tariffs that could potentially benefit Nintendo, and that is a carve out for the import of semiconductors. Now, on the one hand, this is great because it means that semiconductors can be bought into America without the tariffs applying, but Nintendo can't sell a semiconductor on its own. Their plants for assembling machinery are all international. This raises the prospect, I suppose, of whether assembly could be onshored to America and the US could manufacture its own Switch 2s for domestic consumption. But this has its own issues as well. Sure, these semiconductors are one particularly expensive component. Depending on the markups and the cost of the other components, it could be anywhere from 10 to 20% of the wholesale cost of the machinery by estimations I've seen. Removing the tariff on this individually would therefore save perhaps $30. That's not to be sniffed at, but that's not all gravy for Nintendo. For one thing, many of the other component parts would be manufactured elsewhere, and each would be subject to tariff checks as they pass customs, unless, of course, you had each individual part manufactured stateside as well. It wouldn't prevent the Switch 2 from being more expensive to manufacture and likely having a price that needs to be passed on to the consumer. You also need a density of skilled labour. It may be that there are incentives from the government as time goes by to support the development of US-based skills in this particular field, but for now it seems like it will be difficult and perhaps impossible to quickly train people up because there just isn't the hinterland of such a thing. There are other issues as well. This would mean Nintendo bringing their eye of rigorous quality control and scrutiny to a whole bunch of American corporations where they have existing, trusted, long-term relationships elsewhere. Moreover, the costs to hire American labor would be considerably higher compared to international manufacturers. There are ethical defenses to be made of paying labor more, but the corollary would be higher prices for the buyer. And there would be far more ancillary costs for Nintendo. For example, security. We saw in December and January how corrosive the steady drumbeat of leaks and whispers can be to their schedule. It might be even trickier to maintain secrecy if they were based in the US. But what if they could bypass people entirely? In 2020, Nikkei reported that Sony had invested in a nearly completely automated factory that meant that machines came off the assembly line at a pace of about one every 30 seconds. Of course, Nintendo is a company with a great number of engineers. In theory, if you can build a factory process to specification in one country, you can recreate that anywhere. There are still going to be higher upfront costs, land, security and staffing costs to maintain the premises and machinery, but actually having regional factories make some degree of sense too. You save fuel costs and breakage caused by mass transit of too many individual parts to an assembler for one, and you have a far greater supply chain resilience. Nintendo's history of console launches has often been a history of struggling to meet supply. With the Switch and the Wii, these problems were particularly acute, but at various times they have had manufacturing difficulties that have led to a surge in demand. It also protects them from many of the global threats that have to be big concerns to their contingencies planners, from escalating tensions in the East China Sea to supply blockages into Europe through issues in the Middle East, whether from political tensions or simply logistical ones, such as the 6-day obstruction of the Suez Canal in 2021. Global supply chains are relatively cheap and they are great at scale, but they are also fragile, and having a backup plan may be something of significant interest to the company. Nintendo may also be able to appeal to the more patriotically minded American market with a Made in the USA label. Nintendo isn't averse to one-off gimmicky versions. Remember the Queen's gold-plated Wii back in the day, and it's possible to imagine a Stars and Stripes Switch 2 paying for the gimmick in increased attention and sales, potentially from those who wouldn't normally pay much attention to the Switch. There are huge problems with this though. Firstly, Nintendo Switch 2 consoles are not made in all that huge a volume per region. Switch's absolute best year for sales in the Americas was just north of 11 million in the pandemic year, but that was an extreme exception. 5, 6, 7, and 8 million are far more common. That sounds a lot, but when you consider that these are divided down between different types of consoles, Switch and Switch Lite, and in later points also the Switch OLED, the individual runs are smaller, and of course this is serving the whole of the Americas. Now, you might think millions sounds like a lot, and it is, but what if we were talking not Switch numbers, but more like, say, 3DS numbers? 2 million, 3 million, 4 million at peak? That's still a lot of consoles, but the cost of setup would be far more considerable proportionate to the sales. This is a long-term commitment, and in a febrile atmosphere with changes happening abruptly, it would be practically impossible for the necessary deals to be made. The outlay and costs would be monumental, and it might all be for nothing if, in a year's time, trade returns pretty much to 2024 normalcy due to more permanent trade arrangements being struck. Of course, any claim to permanency in trade arrangements would be taken with a pinch of salt, as once tariff-led policies are initiated, constant tinkering soon becomes possible. The 1820s and 1830s in America saw 4 tariff acts in the space of 9 years, and this is before you even consider the possibilities of black swan events causing an abrupt reappraisal of trading conditions globally, as we have seen multiple times in the last few years. And then there are other geopolitical circumstances. And this is why long term, I can see this being just about, maybe, if you squint a bit, sort of bordering on potentially plausible, maybe, in the very, very, very long term. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, sank $12 billion into their Arizona development, but that is a highly specialized endeavor. A more low-key assembly setup seems like it would be much lower in cost, and I wouldn't be able to meaningfully guess what that would be given the number of factors such as land, taxes, manpower, robotics costs and such like, but the US is pretty engaged with the robotics industry, and I would guess that the costs would be in the tens of millions, perhaps the low hundreds of millions of dollars. That is a very substantial outlay, but it wouldn't absolutely rule it out just for that price tag if it guaranteed stability and a strong future for American sales. Ultimately, I expect this situation to reach a resolution and probably reasonably soon, so this is not something that I would expect to see moving in the next year or even in the next 5 years. Still, businesses do adapt to most circumstances over the long term, and if global trade becomes more problematic for whatever reasons, then finding creative solutions will become not just probable, but ultimately necessary. Thank you so much for watching as ever, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.